Have you ever wondered how the world we live in was truly forged? It wasn't in boardrooms or parliaments. It was in the mud smoke and unimaginable horror of the First World War. Imagine a conflict so vast it claimed 17 million lives in just 4 years, leaving another 21 million wounded. These weren't just soldiers. They were our great-grandfathers, farmers, students, and factory workers who marched off to a war they were told would be a grand adventure. But how did it all begin? How did the assassination of a single man, an Austrian archduke, ignite a global catastrophe that pulled in empires from every corner of the earth? To understand, we have to travel back to the summer of 1914. Europe was a continent of glittering empires, brimming with confidence and power. But beneath this shimmering surface, a toxic brew of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism was reaching its boiling point. The great powers were locked into 2 armed camps, each building deadlier weapons and drafting larger armies. Europe was a powder keg, and all it needed was a single spark. On a sunny June morning, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary arrived in Sarajevo. In the crowd, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip waited. A first assassination attempt failed, but later that day, through a bizarre twist of fate, the Archduke's car stalled right in front of Princip. He fired 2 shots, killing the Archduke and his wife. Those 2 bullets would become the most devastating in human history. But the assassination alone didn't cause the war. It was the match that lit the fuse. For decades, Europe had been preparing for this moment. Militarism meant that generals had more influence than diplomats. A complex system of alliances meant that a conflict between 2 nations would automatically drag in all the others. The mad scramble for colonies, or imperialism, had created intense rivalries. And most dangerously, a fervent nationalism had convinced millions that war was a glorious path to national greatness. In the 5 weeks that followed, known as the July Crisis, diplomacy failed catastrophically. Austria-Hungary, determined to crush Serbia, issued an impossible ultimatum. When Serbia couldn't fully comply, Austria declared war. Russia, seeing itself as Serbia's protector, began to mobilize its massive army. This triggered Germany, Austria's ally, to declare war on Russia, and then on Russia's ally, France. Germany's war plan required invading neutral Belgium, which in turn brought the British Empire into the war. In just 1 week, all of Europe was ablaze. Crowds cheered in the streets, convinced their boys would be home by Christmas. They couldn't have been more wrong. Germany's strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, was to knock out France in 6 weeks with a massive invasion through Belgium. The initial advance was terrifyingly successful. But at the Battle of the Marne, just outside Paris, the French and British halted the German steamroller. The war of movement ground to a halt, and both sides dug in. Soon, a 400-mile-long scar of trenches stretched from Switzerland to the sea. The age of trench warfare had begun. On Christmas Eve of 1914, an incredible truce broke out. Soldiers sang carols and exchanged gifts in no man's land. But it would never happen again. The war became an industrial slaughterhouse, defined by machine guns, artillery, and the terrifying new weapon of poison gas. By 1916, the war had become a meat grinder. The Germans launched a massive attack at Verdun, aiming to bleed France white. For 10 months, the battle raged, consuming over 700,000 lives for virtually no gain. To relieve the pressure, the British launched their own offensive at the Somme. On the very first day, 20,000 British soldiers were killed, the worst day in their army's history. The battle dragged on for months, costing over 1 million casualties. It became brutally clear that defensive technology like the machine gun had made attacking suicidal. New weapons like flamethrowers and tanks were introduced to break the stalemate, but only added to the horror. The year 1917 changed everything. In Russia, the war had caused total collapse. Food shortages and mass casualties led to revolution. The Tsar was overthrown, and later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power, pulling Russia out of the war. This was a disaster for the Allies, as it freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops for the Western Front. But just as Russia exited, America entered. German U-boats sinking American ships and a secret telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the U.S. proved to be the final straws. America declared war. Germany now had a closing window of time to win before America's full might could be deployed. In the spring of 1918, Germany threw everything it had into one final massive offensive. Using new stormtrooper tactics, they smashed through Allied lines and advanced 40 miles, once again threatening Paris. It was the closest they came to winning. But their army was exhausted, starving, and out of supplies. In the summer, the Allies counterattacked. Bolstered by over 1 million fresh American troops and using coordinated attacks with tanks and aircraft, they shattered the German lines. At the same time, Germany's allies collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires disintegrated. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. After 4 years of hell, World War I was over, but it left behind a shattered continent, a lost generation, and a bitter peace treaty that sowed the seeds for an even greater conflict just 20 years later. The modern world, with all its triumphs and traumas, was born in those trenches. Thanks for watching, and if you found this journey into the past insightful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history.